Quite a big raft of changes to 40k today. Clarifications on counting as stationary, always fight last and first abilities, no more warp timing Morty, and a ton of other minor changes. Loads to discuss today, so let's go through all the new FAQs and Errata. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking through the monumental amount of FAQs that Games Workshop just unleashed. I think that perhaps this update is to tie in with the new chapter approved. Lots of points changes and mission changes have happened, and they've chosen this time to implement a whole bunch of needed updates or minor bug fixes, both within the core rulebook and across lots of the different codexes as well. The broad strokes of it are that there are quite a lot of small changes to rare rules and certain situations within the core rules, a raft of minor changes and fixes for the Space Marines, nerfs to Drukhari that we talked about yesterday, and a few other bug fixes for Xenos and Chaos. They've also updated a fair few of the Forge World units, making things from Death Guard, Drukhari and Admech fit in just a little bit better with their new codexes. Loads to talk about today then, so let's jump in and see what we've got. First up, we'll go through the core rulebook changes. The first change that they've made is that now deep striking is going to work slightly differently. You will now need to set up greater than 9 inches away horizontally compared with enemy models. I think that this was mainly implemented to close that engagement range loophole. The one where, say, if you charged a model in a tall building, then you could technically get an 8-inch charge off, as technically you could set up 9 inches away diagonally, but engagement range also has a vertical component, so you could shave off a little bit of movement and get an 8-inch charge. Now that's basically never going to be possible due to having to set up 9 inches away horizontally, though it might limit some armies setting up just a little bit, as you're not just going to be able to descend from the skies on the top of a really tall building. Maybe not the biggest problem on normal looking boards, but if you had some crazy high stacked terrain, it could feel a bit weird not being able to land on top of it, just because there happens to be a termagant in the basement. Overall though, I think it's a good fix. Unless you're playing with really tall terrain, it does make sense. And now deep strike charges will always be 9 inches, and there's no ambiguity about people trying to make gamey shorter ones. Next, there's a nice clarification for Chaos Demon Summoning, just a small clarification on abilities that need every unit in your army to be of that same codex or faction. Now, say for Death Guard with Contagions of Nurgle, you check whether every unit in your army has Contagions all at the same time, and that's done at the Muster Armies section of setting up for a battle. That means that if all of your army is Death Guard or unaligned keyword, then you'll be able to get whole army abilities like the Contagions of Nurgle then, and if you do happen to summon up some Nurgle demons halfway through the game, then it no longer breaks your Contagions. I think technically it would have previously, so it's quite nice that they can call upon some Nurgle allies if they summon them up mid-game. I imagine that this might be relevant as well for Thousand Suns and Chaos Space Marines if they get their codexes, and if summoning remains a thing throughout the rest of 9th. Next, there's a small clarification as to abilities working in the deployment phase. Things that happen at the start of deployment are now before transports and reserves are declared. I'm not sure if that has any big implications. I can't think of what they're trying to fix with this one myself. Otherwise, during deployment can be declared any time before transports or reserves, or during the main deployment when you're actually setting up, and after deployment is as before, in the resolve pre-battle abilities step before you start playing. Next up we have a rather specific core rule, which I think is actually meant to be a general fix to the Space Marine Tome of Malkador. Basically they clarify that if you swap out your psychic discipline, then you no longer have access to the previous one. They give the example of a Dark Angel's Librarian swapping out his standard discipline for the Interromancy one, and it means that if he takes the Tome of Malkador, he will no longer be able to take one psychic power from each discipline, it'll be all from the same one. That's a major nerf to that relic, as the main draw to it for me was being able to take psychic powers from different disciplines. Next we have a very tiny buff to Titanic units in relation to difficult ground. Now say if Titanic units are walking over craters or anything that's less than 3 inches in height, they will no longer suffer their -2 penalty to their movement characteristic. This one kind of makes sense cinematically to me. Usually things like an Imperial Knight or a massive Baneblade aren't really going to care too much about going into a small crater. Things that might slow the movement of squads and bikes aren't really likely to be any real concern to a massive war machine like that. Next we have a clarification to always fight first and always fight last abilities. Probably quite an important one, as these abilities seem to be absolutely everywhere within the new codexes. First they count that charging models basically do count as always fighting first, in the same way that say Emperor's Children would get. Then they say that no matter how many different stacking rules you have of both fighting first and fighting last, if you have 2 opposing ones, then none of them count for anything and the unit will fight as normal. Then finally they say that if a unit is affected by an always fights last ability, Provided they don't have any sort of always fight first ability going on, they won't be able to use the counter-offensive stratagem to interrupt in combat. That was the way that it already worked, to be honest, but I think it was suitably confusing that it's good that they issued the FAQ. Now if you have a unit that was charged by an enemy with this ability, it's definitely spelled out that you can't use interrupt to break out of the normal sequence of events. You're just not able to use that stratagem at all. Interestingly though, I think that if you are doing the charging, even if your opponent does have a always fight last ability on you, then it will actually cancel out now. Because charging counts as always having fought first, it means that then that will be counteracted by an always fight last ability, then in general the two are going to cancel out. Maybe a slight buff to charging units there, and a slight nerf to always fight last abilities. Next we have a rule about resurrected models, I suspect mainly being applied to Necrons. Basically destroy models that are returned to the unit don't count as having lost any wounds or having had any attacks allocated to them. I think that this is to get out of you having to allocate more attacks to that model, seeing as you'd presumably already been taken saves on it if it had already been killed. Maybe a minor clarification there, but I don't think it was really changing any way that people played. Next we have the nerf to the Drukhari Succubus's competitive edge. Basically if you have a rule where an attack generates more attacks, say getting extra attacks on the roll of a 6, or the Drukhari Succubus's competitive edge ability, any extra attacks that you generate can't be used with any abilities that make multiple attacks. This is to stop the slightly silly scenario of one model's attacks being multiplied by 2 and then being multiplied by 2 again. A small nerf to competitive edge there, but it still remains a very good warlord trait. Perhaps one of the single biggest changes out of all of this though is the change to counting as stationary models. I think that Games Workshop have made a slightly weird ruling here, as it was something from 8th edition that seems to have weirdly carried over into 9th. Basically, if a model has a rule that counts it as stationary in the shooting phase, then it counts as not having fallen back. I guess it's because of the new wording with the 9th movement rules, either you count as having remained stationary, fallen back, advanced, or having made a normal move. Under the 9th rules, you can't count it as fallen back if you're also counting as remained stationary. Practically, this means that if you have a rule that means that you've remained stationary in the shooting phase, say things like Tau using the Montcar ability, then it means that you can technically fall back and still shoot. Certainly helpful for Tau, anything that allows them to fall back and shoot will be greatly appreciated in 9th. Initially I was quite excited that this could apply to Space Marines as well, with the Ultramarines Doctrine Scions of Guilliman, but it turns out they only count as having remained stationary if they didn't either advance or fall back, so no luck there. In addition, they've actually put out a few slightly contradicting rules which again change the way that the game is played. Firstly, reinforcements never count as having remained stationary, even if they have a rule that would usually mean that they do. This is actually quite a nerf to armies such as Ultramarines. Say you could have an Ultramarines Grav Devastator drop pod, usually that could count as having remained stationary if you deployed it on turn 2, and those Devastators will be able to fire at full accuracy, the same for things like, say, Heavy Eradicators in Strategic Reserve. That now unfortunately is not going to be the case, so that's actually quite a hefty nerf to the Ultramarines Doctrine, as it was quite a big advantage to say have those Heavy Eradicators turn up on the edges of the board and be able to fire at full effect. I believe that this might have been a rule previously as well, but it also doesn't work for transports in any way. The transport can't count as having remained stationary to allow the models to get out of it after moving, or doing an action after advancing or falling back. Finally though, if you do have a rule that allows you to count as remaining stationary when you're in the charge phase, it does mean that you can also fall back and charge. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there are any examples of that. Quite a lot of those abilities count for the shooting phase, but not for the entire turn. A bit of a shake-up to the game there. I'm not sure it was really necessary, to be honest. If anything, I would have expected them to say, even if you counted stationary for shooting, then you still can't shoot if you fell back. That might have felt the more logical response to me, but I guess this is the way that they've chosen to go with. Next we've got a small change to psychic powers. If a psychic power both modifies a characteristic and also has the chance to do extra damage off that characteristic, you do the damage off that unmodified characteristic first. I suspect that this one's specifically targeting the Engulfing Fear power from Dark Angels. It both subtracts 1 from leadership, and also if the psychic test is greater than the leadership, then any of their actions fail. Not sure if there are any other examples aside from that. There's a small clarification about rules preventing or granting OBSEC. This goes the way that I would have played it anyway. If you have 2 rules, one granting a unit OBSEC and one preventing them from using OBSEC abilities, then the one that prevents them from using them takes precedence. There's a clarification on modifying command point costs of stratagems, which I think is largely to get around the interaction of Agents of Vect and the Chief Apothecary's Selfless Healer ability, and they say that the way you play it is that if there's a rule that allows you to change the value to a certain number, then you do that first, then you do any multiplication or division options, then you do any addition or subtraction. The conflict that it's addressing is that, say, the Chief Apothecary Selfless Healer can mean that they can use the Combat Restorative stratagem to set up a Space Marine for 0 CP, but if you use Agents of Vect on that, for the rest of the game it will cost +1 command points. If you don't know which order you apply those in, then it could either cost 0 or 1 CP, depending on how you read it. Under this ruling though, if a Drukhari player uses Agents of Vect on the 0 CP stratagem, it means that it will cost 1 command point for the rest of the game. Finally, for the core rules changes, there's a quick clarification to any abilities that need a unit to move a certain amount of inches or more, saying that they must basically finish that move that far away, they can't just run in circles. It's particularly relevant for the Dark Angel's Death on the Wind secondary. It's quite a powerful one, where you get 2 victory points every time you kill a unit with a Ravenwing unit that's moved at least 12 inches or more, or made a charge move. It didn't say that you couldn't move your bikes across the board and then move them back to the same spot before, but now that's explicitly spelled out. Basically, the bikes will have to move in quite a straight line if they do want to achieve this secondary, and it might actually be a little bit hard to do. Bikes only have a 14-inch move under normal circumstances, so to move greater than 12 inches away from their starting position, they do actually have to move in quite a straight line. If they're trying to go around other units or terrain pieces on the board, then that might not be the easiest thing to do, and it's actually quite a big nerf to this very powerful secondary objective. Now we're leaving the core rulebook behind and we go into the faction-specific stuff. The Space Marines picked up quite a few changes, both in their core book and across a few supplements. Firstly, for one of the Flesh Tearer's Warlord traits, they fixed the discrepancy in Merciless Butcher. Basically, it had 2 different rules depending on whether you took it from the core codex or the Blood Angels decks, and now they've universally adopted the weaker rule, where you get +1 attack for every 5 models within 3 inches of the bearer. Not really a very good one, to be honest. As a minor change to the Space Wolves Venerable Dreadnought, you can now take a Heavy Flamer and a Great Wolf Claw. Previously, under the rules, you were technically locked to a Stormbolter under the Great Wolf Claw. Probably just an oversight when they wrote the datasheet. There's a change to the 1 command point Guerrilla Tactics Phobos stratagem, one where you can redeploy a Phobos unit provided you're greater than 6 inches away from the enemy. You place that unit into Strategic Reserve, but technically because it happened in the movement phase, they could kind of come back straight away immediately on one of the board edges from Strategic Reserve. It could basically teleport a Phobos unit all the way across the board if you needed it to. To bring it in line with most similar abilities to this, now you can't bring them back in the same turn, they will have to wait for a turn off the board if you want to use it. Quite a big nerf to that stratagem, to be honest. Spending a whole turn of a 5-turn game off the board isn't exactly great. Next, there's a clarification on combat squads and their interaction with Teleport Homers, Armorium Cherubs, and Dark Angels Watchers in the Dark. Basically these little pieces of equipment that have a small model but don't actually count as a model for rules purposes. When you split a squad into combat squads, weirdly enough they say that you don't actually have to declare which of the combat squads the ability is in, and later in the game if you did want to use that Watcher in the Dark or the Armorium Cherub, you can trigger it for either unit so it remains flexible until it is consumed. You can't use it twice though, it's only one even if the squad splits in 2. That's the majority of it for the Space Marines. Other than that, there's just that nerf to the Tome of Malkador, and the nerf to the Dark Angel's Death on the Wing secondary with the 12-inch movement thing. Next we have the Drukhari nerfs, which I did cover in a full video yesterday, so feel free to check that out if you haven't already. I won't dwell on things too much again. Raiders go up to 95 points. I think they remain strong but are no longer quite as crazily undercosted. Drazar's up a little bit to 145. Dark Technomancers doesn't work on liquefier guns anymore, though weirdly enough it does seem to still work on the Kronos engine, and the competitive edge Warlord trait has been changed as per that core book change. Overall, a few appreciable nerfs to Drukhari, though the consensus seems to be that they've done quite well with these. Small chips away at some of the most excessive stuff, while still leaving the core of the army intact. In addition to this, in the Imperial Armor Compendium, the Tantalus and the Reaper have also gained power from pain, allowing them to tie in just a little bit better with the rest of the army and the abilities from the new book. Otherwise, there's not too much on the cards for Xenos. Perhaps the single biggest change is the 1 command point buff to the Exocrine. If you spend 1 command point, it now specifically says that it remains stationary, which is quite important for the Exocrine as it allows it to fire its gun twice and also hit on +1 ballistic skill. With that change to the new core rule, it now means that Exocrines can actually fall back and shoot as well, if they drop back from the enemy and use this stratagem to count as remaining stationary. It does make it just a little bit less good on Exocrines coming in from reserve though. Otherwise, there's just one small clarification for Harlequins, where they say that Player of Twilight, the command point refunding Warlord trait, can only be used once per battle round. And there's a quick FAQ to the Necron Silent King, just to clarify how he works in a Supreme Command detachment. I don't think that this actually changes his rules whatsoever, but they basically do say that yes, he does indeed count as being a Zarakan dynasty in a Supreme Command detachment. The detachment would usually gain the Zarakan Uncanny Artificer's dynastic code, but he himself won't get it because he has the dynastic agent keyword, which prevents him gaining a dynastic code at all. They do state though that yes, it does mean that he can use that Zarakan Psychic Denial stratagem, the one that gives you a 50% chance to turn off a psychic power within 18 inches. Neither of those are new changes though, that is the way that he should have been played before. It just wasn't really all that clear, and I think it's helpful for them to issue an FAQ. Next we come to Chaos, and now we finally find a nerf to Warp Time and Prescience. Basically Chaos Space Marines and Thousand Suns can only cast these on things within their own codex. For absolutely ages now, it's been a common option to be able to run a Sorcerer alongside say a Death Guard list, or maybe tag team Ahriman with Mortarion, and then use Warp Time to boost Mortarion all the way up the board and get him into combat very very quickly. Now Chaos Space Marines can only cast those powers on units with the Heretic Astartes keyword, and in the new codex Death Guard were changed to Bubonic Astartes, and their Death Guard keyword can't be changed for the standard Legion keywords in Codex Chaos Space Marines. Basically this just means that Thousand Suns will be buffing Thousand Suns, Chaos Marines will be buffing Chaos Marines, and no more Warp Time for Mortarion, I'm afraid. Otherwise there are another couple of changes for the Death Guard. They have clarified that Typhus can be used in other Plague Company detachments. I think that his special rule heavily implied that he was supposed to be anyway, but I think that technically he fell foul of a rule that meant rules as written you can't mix and match Plague Companies, even with the rules being obvious that Typhus really was meant to be taken in any one. In any case, that loophole seems to be closed. Otherwise, from Forge World, the Greater Blight Drone also gains Contagions of Nurgle, so it will get its expanding aura of -1 toughness as the game goes on. Finally, as well as the ones that we've already seen, there are a few other changes to the Imperial Armor Compendium. For the Abmech, in line with their new codex, they've updated the Hoplites and Palasts to gain the Doctrina Imperatives instead of the Canticles of the Omnissiah as they would have got previously. A little bit of a weapon skill buff might help them out in the new list. There's no changes on the Terrax drill, that one still retains the Canticles of the Omnissiah, and that might not be such a bad thing for 3d6-inch charges out of Deep Strike. Otherwise, they've finally fixed the Death Rider Command Squadron role. In the initial printing of the Compendium, they had the Command Squadron labelled as Fast Attack and the Standard Squadron as Elites. They've now confirmed that they're both supposed to be swapped over. The Command Squadron is now in the Elite section, and the regular one is in the Fast Attack. Shame that they took such a hefty points nerf in the new chapter approved. Finally, Braearth Ashmantle got the Burning Wrath 3-inch flamer attack become an assault weapon rather than a pistol, which totally made sense as it was basically a weapon that he was never going to use. Vehicles like him can fire their standard weapons in combat anyway, so pistol had no value, and because he can't fire pistols and regular weapons at the same time, it meant that he was locked out of this small flamer attack. Now at least he'll be able to blaze away with that small 2d6 attack flamer, in addition to the very nasty flamer that he already gets. That's it for the Imperial Armor Compendium, apart from the Tantalus getting power from pain, and the Greater Blight Drone getting contagions. So a fairly hefty whack of changes there. For the most part I think that Games Workshop has done pretty well. Lots of small and niggling rules loopholes closed, maybe a few slightly weird decisions here and there, occasional nerfs that didn't really need to happen, particularly to Ultramarines I think. But on the whole I think it makes the game a little bit more watertight and robust, and have fewer situations where people don't know what to do. I'm sure in amongst all of these I might have misunderstood these or missed bits. If there's anything else important, please let me know down in the comments below, and if there are any major errors that I've made, I'll post them below as a pinned comment. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly be keeping these videos coming. I generally try and upload new 40k content every single day, so subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you are enjoying watching a lot of these videos, any support on the channel's Patreon page is enormously appreciated. It is what allows me to keep on making this content quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.